George III is most famous for being on the throne when England lost its American colonies and for eventually becoming mentally unstable in his later years. But also notable was his marriage to Princess Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, which resulted in 15 children. Did they all lead interesting lives? You bet. Less than a year after they were married, King George III and Queen Charlotte welcomed their first child. Since it was a boy, they christened him George as well, and he would indeed go on to become George IV. But young George would end up taking over long before his dad died in 1820. By 1811, it was clear that the spells of mental instability that had come and gone earlier in George III's life were becoming much more regular. His eldest son, then the Prince of Wales, was appointed regent for the next decade. George IV was nicknamed Prinny, according to Westminster Abbey. He was obsessed with fashion, food, women, and alcohol, and also liked spending money.
How do you look so fabulous, George? You are worth it.
It was only after living with a mistress for most of his adult life and having many illegitimate children that he agreed to marry someone appropriate, only so Parliament could pay off his huge debts. Unfortunately, he and Princess Caroline of Brunswick hated each other from day one. Their wedding night produced their only child, and they lived apart after that. George died in 1830. The second son of the monarch is traditionally styled the Duke of York, which is why that's Prince Andrew's title today. But while the modern Duke of York was stripped of his honorary military titles for association with Jeffrey Epstein, Prince Frederick lost his role as commander-in-chief of the British Army in 1809 because it was discovered his mistress was selling commissions. What does that mean? In a nutshell, people paid her to make sure they got promoted. Frederick's involvement was unclear, but officially Parliament found he'd done nothing wrong. Since Frederick's older brother George wasn't doing much to shore up the line of succession with a bunch of kids, everyone was relying on George's only legitimate child, Princess Charlotte. When she died in childbirth in 1817, Frederick became his brother's heir. All Frederick needed to do was outlive George and he'd be king, which he failed to do, dying in 1827. Frederick had no children of his own since he didn't like his wife, Princess Frederica Charlotte of Prussia, either. The Royal Collection Trust says they lived separately soon after their marriage. For most of his life, Prince William, Duke of Clarence and St. Andrews, would have never expected to get anywhere near the throne. But George and Frederick's distaste for their wives meant they only had one legitimate child between them, and when both his older brothers and his niece died before him, William became king in 1830. Since he was considered very much a spare in the royal succession, he had a bit more freedom. At just 13 years old, William joined the Royal Navy. He traveled the world and even fought in the American Revolution. The BBC says he loved being a sailor and was eventually promoted to Admiral of the Fleet. After he retired in 1791, William came back to England and settled down with a mistress. 20 years later, he left her and their 10 illegitimate children to marry Princess Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen. Despite 4 pregnancies, none of their children lived longer than 3 months. This meant when William died in 1837, he was succeeded by his niece, who would become the illustrious Queen Victoria. After 3 sons, George III and Queen Charlotte finally had a daughter in 1766, whom they named after her mother. According to princesses, the 6 daughters of George III, she was unofficially given the title Princess Royal at birth, before it was made official in her 20s. George III made sure she got an education, spoke multiple languages, and spent a lot of time with him. However, his love for her and for his subsequent daughters would backfire on them. The Royal Collection Trust says that George really didn't want them to get married ever. He'd seen his sister's disastrous marriages and couldn't bear to see his girls end up as scorned and hated wives. The spinster Charlotte would finally end up getting married at the age of 31, the first of George III's daughters to do so, to the widowed Prince Frederick of Württemberg. They had no children of their own. George III belonged to the House of Hanover, named after the electorate in the modern-day Germany, which George I left when he was elevated to the British throne in 1714.
Ich liebe Deutschland, ja.
Yes, I know you love Germany. Some would say for an English king, you spend rather too much time there.
Was?
Nothing.
George III would even be crowned King of Hanover in 1814, although he never actually went there. But some of his children did, including Prince Edward, who moved there when he was 18 and enlisted as a cadet in the Hanoverian Foot Guards. The following year, he returned home to England and joined the British Army. Unfortunately, due to an incident of being absent without leave and his use of harsh discipline, Edward was sent to Canada as punishment in 1791. Perhaps unexpectedly for a royal, Edward was liberal for the time. His views that slavery was bad, Catholics had a right to worship as they wished, and the American colonies should have freedom if they wanted it were extremely radical. He married in 1818, and the couple became the parents of the future Queen Victoria. Edward died in 1820 when she was less than a year old. George III enjoyed having a daughter so much once Charlotte Princess Royal was born that he was disappointed when their 5th child was another boy. Fortunately for him, Princess Augusta Sophia did not disappoint. Augusta received an education like her older sister, although she could be a bit of a terror to her tutors. She was reportedly a handful. She once wrote an apology letter addressing her own behavior, which she signed in blood. Many people noted how beautiful Augusta was, and she received a handful of proposals from men who were acceptably important enough to marry a princess. But her father had to approve of any offers of marriage, and he never did. Unlike her older sister, Augusta would remain single her whole life, although there is some evidence she had a secret relationship with an army general. She died in 1840, age 71. All the daughters of George III and Queen Charlotte were attractive, but Elizabeth, born in 1770, was not considered the prettiest of the bunch, something it seems she was reminded of quite often. Fortunately, she had a determined personality, according to princesses, the 6 daughters of George III. Princess Elizabeth was extremely artistic and found many ways to express this talent. She gifted books of intricate paper cutouts to friends, designed decorative panels for one of the royal residences, and published 2 series of engravings. Elizabeth, like her sisters, suffered from the king's wish that they not get married. In 1818, 2 years before her father died and long after he lost the mental capacity to refuse, her brother, the Prince Regent, gave the then 48-year-old Elizabeth permission to marry Prince Frederick of Hesse-Homburg. Unlike England, the Kingdom of Hanover had laws requiring that their monarch be male. That meant that in 1837, when William IV, also the then King of Hanover, died, his successor Queen Victoria could not also ascend to the dynasty's Germanic throne. With his 3 other older brothers long dead, this meant Prince Ernest Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, got the crown and moved to Hanover. No one in England missed him. Called the most hated man in the country, a review of Queen Victoria, A Portrait, in the Los Angeles Times, addresses stories that he murdered his valet and raped one of his sisters. It's worth mentioning that while there's no solid proof, both these accusations are extremely credible. It's not surprising then that the National Portrait Gallery reports someone tried to assassinate the Duke in 1810, or that he left England for an entire decade from 1818 to 1828. He died in 1851. Prince Augustus was openly for the abolition of slavery, but instead of just supporting the religious rights of Catholics, Augustus was even more controversially a supporter of the Jewish faith. He spoke in favor of lifting legal restrictions placed on Jewish people living in England and became the patron of a hospital dedicated to helping Jewish children and families. Augustus was well educated with a massive library, an active interest in science, and such a strong passion for theology that he considered getting ordained. The Duke got married not once, but twice without asking the monarch's permission. That made the unions illegal for a royal, which he was very aware of. While his first marriage ended in an annulment, his second in 1831 held strong until his death in 1843. Queen Victoria never knew her father, as he died when she was an infant, but Prince Augustus played a fatherly role. The pair were very close, and he even gave Victoria away at her marriage to Prince Albert. According to the Royal Collection Trust, Prince Adolphus was the favorite son. Despite this, he was sent away to Hanover when he was just 12 years old. He studied at a university there and at 16 joined the Hanoverian military. He saw real action while England was fighting a post-revolution France at the end of the 18th century. During a battle in 1793, he was wounded, captured, and then rescued. A review of Adolphus Frederick, Duke of Cambridge, steadfast son of King George III, 1774 to 1850, hammers home the point that while most of the sons of George III were profligate, Adolphus was the middle-of-the-road, level-headed guy you wanted in a crisis. His ability to get people, from his family members to politicians, to maintain cooler heads may have even stopped a rebellion in Hanover when he was viceroy there later in his life. Every family has that member who takes on the caregiver role whenever a loved one is sick or injured. In George III and Queen Charlotte's family, that was Princess Mary. She was nurse to multiple members of the large brood, including as the main caretaker for her younger sister, Princess Amelia, who contracted tuberculosis as a teenager. She also cared for her father after he became mentally unstable and stayed with him at Windsor Castle for years during the last decade of his life.
Please, His Majesty must see that he's not well.
I suppose I have been a bit off color.
Mary finally married in 1816 when she was 40. The groom was her cousin, Prince William Frederick, Duke of Gloucester and Edinburgh. He turned out to be a terrible husband, though, often abandoning her for long periods. After he died, Mary seemed to come into her own, and she enjoyed her life until 1857, when she became the last of George and Charlotte's children to die. Princess Sophia was educated like her sisters, but was much more sheltered than most of them. According to the Royal Collection Trust, she was primarily Queen Charlotte's companion and never really saw people outside of the family and servants. Once her mother died in 1818, Sophia got a little more freedom, but she never married. There is, however, some evidence she got pregnant around 1800. The father was said to be a servant in the employment of her father, but there were rumors that Prince Ernest Augustus did rape one of his sisters, and that it was Sophia who was the survivor of his assault. This has led to speculation that if she gave birth to an illegitimate secret baby, it might have been a product of that rape. Sophia died in 1848. Both she and Prince Augustus Frederick declined burial with the rest of their family. Instead, they were interred in the public Kensal Green Cemetery in London. Born 19 months apart, sadly, Prince Octavius and Prince Alfred would die just 8 months apart from the same cause. At a time when smallpox was rampant and could mean a death sentence or disfigurement, Queen Charlotte insisted her children be inoculated. But inoculations are not vaccines, and there was a small but real risk the patient would die. Alfred, who had a heart defect, sadly passed away after his inoculation just a month shy of his 2nd birthday. The next year, Octavius and Sophia were also inoculated against smallpox. Sophia had no complications, but sadly, Octavius also became unwell and died within days at the age of 4. They commissioned a painter to depict Alfred welcoming Octavius to heaven. The king hung it in his dressing room at Windsor Castle, where he would have seen it every day. George III and Queen Charlotte's 15th and last child, Princess Amelia, was born after her older brothers Princes Octavius and Alfred died. This meant she was more than 5 years younger than the next oldest, Princess Sophia. Amelia started showing symptoms of tuberculosis when she was 15 and went away to a seaside resort, one of the few attempts at a cure that was available at the time. While there, she fell in love with her chaperone, Colonel Charles Fitzroy, and told one of her brothers that as far as she was concerned, they were basically married, although she did want to marry him officially one day. Unfortunately, that day would never come. Amelia was the king and queen's 3rd child and 1st daughter to die, aged 27 in 1810. Her father was at her deathbed, although his mental state was already disturbed, and her passing may have pushed him over the edge into his final bout of madness. After her death, the king often spoke about her as if she was still alive. We all remember Teddy Roosevelt, one of the most iconic presidents in American history. But what about his children? From war heroes to political influencers, here's the truth about his influential kids.
It's time for your next adventure.
Theodore Roosevelt's oldest child, and only child with his first wife Alice Hathaway Lee, was Alice Lee Roosevelt, born in 1884. Her mother died just 2 days later, the same day that her paternal grandmother died, sending her father into a deep depression. He never called Alice by her first name, instead only referring to her as Baby Lee. Roosevelt sent her to live with his sister until he remarried in 1886. Afterward, Alice lived with her stepmother and eventually 5 half-siblings wherever her father's career led them, which by the end of 1901 meant the White House. Alice became a celebrity first daughter, beloved by the American public for her beauty and acts of teenage rebellion, such as smoking and gambling. In 1906, Alice married Congressman Nicholas Longworth of Ohio and switched her focus from socializing to politics. She held salons in her home in which leading minds were invited to discourse on various ideas. At these gatherings, she cemented her reputation as a sparkling wit, especially in her criticisms of the politics of her cousins, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt.
I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people.
She was an ardent supporter of American isolationism and played a significant role in persuading the United States not to join the League of Nations and to remain neutral in World War II until Pearl Harbor. Alice Roosevelt Longworth, sometimes known as the Other Washington Monument for her powerful influence in Washington society, passed away in 1980 at age 96. Theodore's first child with his second wife, Edith Kermit Caro, was Theodore Roosevelt Jr., known as Ted. He was born in 1887 and shared many of his father's interests, such as hunting and exploring. However, he felt considerable pressure as the son and namesake of the president, which caused him to suffer migraine headaches through much of his young life. Nevertheless, he followed his father's example by attending Harvard, where he performed well. After graduation, he became a partner in an investment banking firm in Philadelphia. His real desire was to serve in the military. After marrying Eleanor Butler Alexander, with whom he would have 4 children, Ted got his chance to serve in World War I. He and his younger brother Archibald were commissioned as officers in 1917, and Ted and Eleanor went to France, leaving their children with Ted's mother, as Eleanor worked as a supervisor for female volunteers. In 1918, Ted was shot in the knee while still suffering the effects of a gas attack, and his life was saved by his brother-in-law, a doctor serving in the war. Ted then entered politics, serving in the New York Assembly, then as Assistant Secretary to the Navy, Governor of Puerto Rico, and Governor of the Philippines. Then World War II began. He re-enlisted and became a brigadier general. Ted earned a Medal of Honor for his actions at Normandy in 1944, but died a few weeks later of a heart attack. He was 56 years old. The third eldest child of Theodore Roosevelt was Kermit Roosevelt, born in 1889 to Roosevelt's second wife, Edith. Kermit had a great love of travel and adventure, and in 1909 he accompanied his father on an African safari in exchange for the promise that he would excel in his studies at Harvard, which he did, graduating in just 3 years. In 1913, Roosevelt and Kermit went together on their famously ill-fated expedition to Brazil in search of the source of the River of Doubt. Kermit traveled widely around the world and was skilled in picking up new languages, becoming proficient in at least 9. Besides publishing books about his travels, Kermit also served as a bank manager in Buenos Aires before joining the British Army in 1917 after the outbreak of World War I. When the American Expeditionary Force arrived in Europe in 1918, he was made a captain in the U.S. Army. Kermit was the only one of his brothers not to be seriously injured in the war. Afterward, he founded a steamship company, but was hit hard by the Great Depression and alcoholism. Despite attempts by his family to help him by getting him a post in the U.S. Army once World War II began, Kermit was nevertheless discharged from the Army as medically unfit due to his alcoholism in 1943, though he would be reinstated just a few months later. In June of that year, Kermit took his own life at Fort Richardson in Alaska, where he is still buried today. The youngest daughter of Theodore and Edith Roosevelt was Ethel Carroll Roosevelt, born in 1891. In contrast to her headline-making half-sister Alice, Ethel was much more private and familial, helping take care of her younger brothers and assisting her mother in the administration of the White House staff. She married Surgeon Richard Derby in 1913, and the two had 4 children together. When Derby went to France in 1914 to aid in the war effort, Ethel went with him and served as a nurse in the American Ambulance Hospital, as well as volunteering for the Red Cross, an organization with which she would work for the next 6 decades. After returning from the war, Ethel became a leader in their home community of Oyster Bay, New York, working for the local Red Cross and nursing service, volunteering at her Episcopal church, and advocating for low-income housing to help fight racial discrimination. After her mother's death in 1948, Ethel became the de facto center of the Roosevelt family, working to secure the legacy of her family and her father in particular by becoming a trustee of the American Museum of Natural History in New York, turning the Roosevelt family home into a museum, and helping to create the Theodore Roosevelt Nature Center on Long Island in conjunction with the Audubon Society. Ethel died at age 86 in 1977 and is buried with her husband and parents in Oyster Bay. Archibald Bullock Roosevelt, better known as Archie, was the second youngest son of Theodore and Edith Roosevelt, born in 1894. Just 7 when his father became president, Archie spent most of his childhood in the White House, though he was known to be much quieter than his siblings. Like his brothers, he attended Harvard, graduating in 1917 and marrying Grace Lockwood that same year. After graduation, Archie worked at a carpet company until World War I, where he served with distinction as an officer and was noted for his bravery. He received numerous citations for his courage, including France's Croix de Guerre, but he was given a full disability discharge after suffering major damage to his leg from an artillery bombardment. After the war, Archie worked with Sinclair Consolidated Oil Company, but distanced himself after the Teapot Dome scandal, moving instead into the finance industry. When World War II began, Archie asked his cousin, President Franklin Roosevelt, to appoint him to an officer position and was made a lieutenant colonel. He once again served with distinction before receiving a full disability discharge, making him the only American soldier to be medically discharged for the same injury in 2 wars. Following World War II, Archie supported numerous conservative organizations, especially the John Birch Society. He died in 1979 at the age of 85 and is buried with much of the rest of his family in Oyster Bay. The youngest child of Theodore Roosevelt was Quentin Roosevelt, born in 1897, just 4 years before his father became president. Quentin was well known for his wild antics on the White House grounds together with a group of other children, including the son of future President William Howard Taft, who gained the name the White House Gang for their misadventures.
They did spitballs at the presidential portraits once and got in some trouble for it with the president.
Like his brothers, Quentin also attended Harvard, where he met Flora Whitney, great-granddaughter of railroad tycoon Cornelius Vanderbilt, to whom he became engaged. Unlike his brothers, Quentin didn't finish Harvard. He dropped out at the onset of World War I to join the military. He signed up for the United States Army Air Service and became a combat pilot. On July 14, 1918, during the Second Battle of the Marne, Quentin's plane was surrounded by 3 enemy fighters. He was shot down behind enemy lines and died there near a village in France at the age of 20. He was initially buried at the crash site by the Germans out of respect for his father, but in 1955, his body was moved to be next to his brother Ted's in Normandy. As of this video, Quentin Roosevelt is the only child of a U.S. president to die in combat. Theodore Roosevelt was reportedly devastated by the loss of his youngest son and remained so until his own death a few months later. You probably know that Tina Turner was the queen of rock and roll, but how much do you know about her 4 sons? Her eldest son was born when she was 18 years old, fathered by musician Raymond Hill. After Tina and Hill split, she began what's perhaps her most famous relationship with Ike Turner, bandleader with the Kings of Rhythm, whom she later married. Before their contentious split in 1978, the pair had their only child. She also adopted 2 of Ike's children from an earlier relationship. In 2018, Tina Turner's eldest son, Craig Raymond Turner, died by suicide at his home in California. He was just 59 years old. Sadly, Craig Turner was old enough to remember the domestic violence rife in his mother's relationship with Ike. When Craig was a child, Tina had even attempted suicide herself. She later described her eldest son as emotional and prone to sadness. Before his death, Craig worked in real estate in Beverly Hills and lived in an apartment his mother had bought for him. After Craig's death, Tina scattered his ashes off the Californian coast. She later posted on Twitter, "My saddest moment as a mother, you will always be my baby." That same year, Tina told BBC News that before he died, Craig had revealed that he had entered into a romantic relationship. He had planned to introduce his new partner to his mother on his birthday. Tina Turner's youngest biological son, Ronnie Turner, passed away in December 2022. It was later determined that he had died from complications from colon cancer. Ronnie experienced addiction and legal issues as a young adult, but ultimately followed his mother's and father's footsteps into show business. At the time of his death, he was married to Afida Turner. After his death, Afida called her husband a terrific musician and an amazing soul. They had no children. Of all of Tina Turner's children, her eldest adopted son, Ike Turner Jr., is most closely linked to the music industry. Born in 1958 to Ike Turner Sr. and Lorraine Taylor, Ike Jr. has a 2006 Grammy Award to his credit as the producer of his father's album, Risin' with the Blues. Having played music from the age of 13, Ike Jr. teamed up with the former Ike Turner Revue backup singer Randy Love in 2017. In 2018, Ike Jr. released a single, Freaky, performing with Sweet Randy Love and Love Thing Band. The same year, he revealed to the Daily Mail that his adopted mother estranged herself from the two children she adopted while married to Ike Sr. In that same interview, Ike Jr. said, "Tina raised me from the age of 2. She's the only mother I've ever known, but I haven't talked to my mother since God knows when, probably around 2000. I don't think any of my brothers have talked to her in a long time either." In 2018, Ike Jr. gave an update on Michael Turner to the Daily Mail. He said, "Michael is in a convalescent home in Southern California and needs medical support. I've been to see him quite a few times. He's doing great." At that time, Ike Jr. added that the only contact Tina had with her adopted son Michael was through financial support. Previously, while speaking to Sunday Mercury, Michael had revealed that he experienced addiction issues as an adult. He said, "I know in my heart if I called Tina or my father, Ike, right now, they would come and help me, but I just can't do that. Tina was really good to me and I love her, but I can't live with anybody. I gotta be free to do what I want to do." According to Fox News, Michael, Ronnie, and Ike Jr. were devastated to be mostly left out of their mother's HBO Max documentary, Tina. In a bizarre true crime story too weird to believe, FDR's son Elliot was accused of hiring a hitman to assassinate the governor of the Bahamas. But why? Anna Roosevelt was the eldest child and only daughter of President Franklin Roosevelt and his wife Eleanor. Anna became a writer and journalist, and in 1935 she married her second husband, journalist Clarence John Bodiger. The couple got their break when newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst offered them both jobs at the Seattle Post-Intelligencer. Hearst made Bodiger publisher, giving him a platform to support FDR politically, even when Hearst broke with the president. But the couple was a package deal, meaning Hearst had to give Anna a job too. He had the perfect one, making her an associate editor in charge of the women's pages. That chapter of their lives ended when World War II broke out. Bodiger signed up with the U.S. military in 1942, and a year later, Anna returned to the White House. In the White House, she acted as de facto First Lady and White House hostess. Her mother was too politically active to be bothered with social functions, so Anna served in her stead. Given her role as Roosevelt's social secretary, Anna asked to accompany her father to the 1945 Yalta Conference, where he met with Joseph Stalin and Winston Churchill to decide the fate of post-war Europe. President Roosevelt, who was dying of heart disease, had the option of picking either Eleanor or Anna. For the president, the decision was easy. His marriage with Eleanor was on the rocks, particularly as rumors swirled about his affair with Lucy Mercer Rutherford, so he put Anna on the delegation to avoid bringing her mother. At Yalta, Anna's job was to make the ailing president's life as easy as possible, mostly by ensuring that social functions ran smoothly so FDR could focus on his duties without compromising his health.
Prime Minister Churchill arrived with his daughter. They were greeted by Mrs. Bodiger.
However, the conference and its aftermath resulted in friction with her mother. In 1945, President Roosevelt died. Naturally, Anna told her mother of the circumstances of the death, including a revelation that may have stung Eleanor. FDR spent his last moments with Lucy. Anna had known about the affair for years, but concealed it from her mother, who took it as a personal betrayal of sorts. Following her father's death in 1945, Anna reprised her media career, purchasing an Arizona weekly newspaper alongside her husband. They had turned it into a daily by 1947, and although there was some initial success, the venture failed, leaving the couple indebted. The venture strained the marriage, leading them to separate and eventually divorce in 1949. 3 years later, her third marriage to James Halstead saw her pivot to nonprofits and international organizations. She died in 1975 of cancer at the age of 69. James Roosevelt took a series of jobs in military service with the elite Carlson's Raiders in the Pacific during World War II before returning to the United States to pursue a political career in California. In California, James remained a Democrat, but he got himself in trouble with the party for supporting Republican Dwight Eisenhower, defending Richard Nixon, and endorsing Ronald Reagan's 1980 and 1984 presidential bids. Roosevelt justified his endorsement by claiming that Reagan was the best choice to continue Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal legacy. But in 1987, the Los Angeles Times reported that James's National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare was facing accusations of running a fundraising scam that degraded the Roosevelt name. It allegedly used scare tactics to solicit donations from the elderly who depended upon both programs. The PAC argued that both programs risked major solvency crises down the road, and the House Ways and Means Committee summoned James to testify. The incident revealed a break between James and the Reagan administration's policies. The PAC's executive director Landis Neal made it crystal clear that donors to the organization were frightened by the Reagan administration, presumably a reference to various cuts to social services. The scandal followed James until he died in 1991 at the age of 83. In 1909, the future presidential couple lived in New York City with their two children, Anna and James. That year, Eleanor Roosevelt wrote in her 1937 memoir, This Is My Story, that she gave birth to a third forgotten Roosevelt child, the first Franklin Roosevelt Jr., in March of 1909. Eleanor wrote that this child was, quote, the biggest and most beautiful of all the babies. For the first months of his life, he was mostly under the care of nurses. He seemed to be doing fine, despite his mother's worries that he would be a difficult child. But in November, he, along with his two siblings, contracted the flu. A doctor's visit confirmed that he had sustained heart damage, and the child died. Eleanor, in her memoir, regretted not having spent more time with the child and blamed herself for his death. She even wrote that at the funeral, it seemed cruel to leave him out there alone in the cold. The child was buried at the St. James Episcopal Church in Hyde Park, New York. But in December 1909, Eleanor found herself pregnant again with another son, Elliott Roosevelt. Elliott Roosevelt was known as Franklin Roosevelt's black sheep son, as he was involved in all sorts of weird hustles.
Did you ever sell Christmas trees?
Yes.
Did he?
Yes.
But his shady reputation was mostly earned through involvement in various contracting scandals involving aircraft. The first scandal occurred in 1934 and dropped in the press in 1936. The younger Roosevelt had entered into an agreement with Dutch aviation company Fokker to sell military aircraft to the Soviet Union disguised as civilian planes through a shell company set up by Elliott Roosevelt. They would split the profits. A scandal brewed because the plan stank of influence peddling. Elliott had taken the deal knowing that foreign governments would be more open to working with him because he was the president's son. The president objected but did not stop him. Elliott denied any financial exchange or illegal conduct, noting that the deal collapsed before payments because the Soviets backed out. The second scandal came in 1943 when Howard Hughes tried to sell the government a new photo reconnaissance airplane. He had the support of Elliott Roosevelt, then a colonel in the Air Corps. The allegation was that the first son had once again put his thumb on the scale in a quid pro quo arrangement with Hughes. Hughes' agent John Meyer wined and dined Elliott, spending over $5,000 for him to meet beautiful women at New York's most exclusive clubs, presumably in return for getting the military to buy Hughes' plane. Roosevelt denied all wrongdoing, saying he had been abroad when Meyer's records had the meeting.
And did any of those girls who were paid, were they procured for my entertainment?
Later in life, Elliott Roosevelt faced a fresh scandal involving an alleged contract killing. On September 18, 1973, Louis Mastriani, a man previously convicted of securities frauds, testified to the Senate that Elliott Roosevelt had been part of an alleged plot to kill the governor of the Bahamas, Lyndon Pindling. The dispute at the center of the alleged plot was straight out of the world of organized crime. Pindling had allegedly reneged on a promise to give a casino license to one Mickey McLaney in return for $1 million donation. McLaney reportedly had connections to some very dangerous people, including Murder Inc. honcho Meyer Lansky. Mastriani testified that Elliott Roosevelt offered him $100,000, including $7,500 upfront in cash and a $2,500 check from McLaney to whack the Bahamian governor. Weeks later, the New York Times reported that Elliott appeared in Washington to refute the charges, calling them vicious lies, resulting in emotional, physical, and financial stress beyond endurance. He further called Mastriani's claims a hoax and demanded he be prosecuted. The evidence was inconclusive. A check made out to Mastriani was entered into congressional records, so there was no doubt that Roosevelt had associated with him. but there was no way to determine whether the money was for the alleged hit job, which Mastroianni claimed was called off because it would be impossible to escape the Bahamas quickly to cover his tracks. Elliott Roosevelt died in 1990 at the age of 80. The second Franklin Roosevelt Jr. survived infancy and went on to have a distinguished military career after graduating from Harvard and the Navy ROTC program. When the United States entered World War II in 1941, he signed on to the U.S. Navy. He was posted to Europe, where he was granted no favors as the president's son and cast into the thick of the action. Roosevelt's commission brought him first to North Africa and then to Sicily in 1943. Then he was a lieutenant on the USS Mayrant, where the crew affectionately called him Big Poncho. In Sicily, he earned a Silver Star and Purple Heart for heroism during a German air raid against the Sicilian capital, Palermo. The original military citation reads that Roosevelt Jr. was decorated for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action. German bombers struck explosive munitions sitting near the docks, causing an explosion and sending shrapnel towards the Maynard. As the bombs continued to fall, the first son rushed to help two wounded crewmates, giving them first aid under fire and carrying them off the ship to safety, saving them. After Palermo, FDR Jr. was transferred to the Pacific alongside a promotion to lieutenant commander, the USS Moore destroyer to command, and a new nickname, Big Moose. He saw action in the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, earning another battery of decorations there. After the war, he represented New York in Congress on a third-party ticket and headed the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission under Lyndon Johnson. He died in 1988 at the age of 74. John Roosevelt was FDR's youngest child and a bit of a political maverick. His brothers all held political office. Elliott was mayor of Miami Beach, while Franklin Jr. and James were congressmen and federal bureaucrats in the Democratic Party. John broke with family tradition on both counts. Unlike his siblings, and much to their chagrin, John was a Republican, making his party affiliation official in 1947. He also never held political office. The closest he ever came was considering a run for the mayoralty of New York City in 1957. He preferred to support candidates, lending his financial muscle and influence to Dwight Eisenhower, Ronald Reagan, and most annoyingly for his family, Richard Nixon. John became a successful businessman. He died from heart failure in 1981 at the age of 65. For much of his decades-long career, Johnny Cash's personal life was as much a part of the public conversation as his music. Indeed, as one of the original so-called country outlaws, Cash lived the life he sang about, often battling drug addiction and various other troubles. His relationships have also played a part in the Johnny Cash narrative, including his toxic marriage to his first wife, Vivian Liberto Cash, to whom he was unfaithful and inattentive. Similarly, his marriage to June Carter Cash was far from perfect and also marred by substance abuse issues and infidelity.
I never did cocaine or heroin, or never did shoot up, but I did every pill they ever made. I was a connoisseur.
Over the course of his 2 marriages, Cash fathered 5 children, 4 girls with his first wife and a son with his second. All his kids have followed in their father's footsteps, if not necessarily into country music, then into the entertainment industry more broadly. Though none have achieved the same iconic level of recognition or fame as Cash himself, 2 of Cash's children are Grammy winners, including the popular recording artist and writer Rosanne Cash. Rosanne, Johnny Cash's oldest child with his first wife Vivian Liberto Cash, followed her dad into country music, had a few hits, and is active to this day. Over her 14 studio albums, she has won 4 Grammy Awards and been nominated for 16 in total, most recently winning 3 in 2014 for her Americana album, The River and the Thread. She was honored by the Country Music Hall of Fame as its 2015 Artist in Residence and also inducted into the Nashville Songwriters Hall of Fame the same year. Her Billboard-topping hits include I Don't Want to Spoil the Party, I Don't Know Why You Don't Want Me, and 7-Year Ache. Rosanne Cash is also the author of 4 books, including her best-selling memoir Composed, about life with and without her father, as well as her own growth as a performer. Cindy Cash, Johnny Cash's third child with Vivian Liberto, took a page out of both her father and her sister's books, performing as a country musician in the group Next Generation, which also included the children of such music icons as Conway Twitty, Loretta Lynn, and George Jones and Tammy Wynette. This group, sadly, did not last very long. John Carter Cash, the only son of Johnny Cash and the only child from his marriage to June Carter, followed a similar path. He primarily works in country music as a producer, winning a Grammy for his work on his mother's album Press On in 1999, and working with other musicians such as Loretta Lynn, Willie Nelson, George Jones, and Sheryl Crow. He also recorded several albums of his own music, beginning in 2003 with Bitter Harvest. Carter Cash is also a writer, penning 3 children's books, a biography of his mother, and a memoir about his relationship with his father. Kathleen "Kathy" Cash had probably the lowest public profile of her siblings, appearing in a single movie but otherwise living a life of relative obscurity. In 2005, she publicly complained that the movie Walk the Line inaccurately portrayed her mother Vivian as a shrew. Kathy told Today, My mom was basically a non-entity in the entire film except for the mad little psycho who hated his career. That's not true. She loved his career and was proud of him until he started taking drugs and stopped coming home. Reportedly, Kathy walked out of a family-only screening of the movie 5 times. Released in 2020, the documentary My Darling Vivian takes a closer and arguably more accurate look at Cash's first wife and their 13-year marriage. Pulling from interviews with the former couple's daughters, old letters, and photographs, the film is an homage to a woman who faded into negative obscurity after Vivian and Johnny split. Vivian and Johnny's youngest daughter, Tara, also appears to have chosen a life of relative obscurity, although she contributed photographs to a book about her father. She has also done some work in costuming as a designer and as wardrobe assistant on a couple of TV shows and movies.
J. Robert Oppenheimer left behind a complicated legacy when he passed away in 1967, but the atomic bomb wasn't the only impact he left on the world. He was also the father of 2 children, Peter and Catherine Tony Oppenheimer. Robert had his children with his wife Catherine Kitty Oppenheimer, whom the theoretical physicist met a few years before the Los Alamos project began. The two married on November 1, 1940, and Peter was born a short time later. In 1944, Tony was born on the Los Alamos laboratory site in New Mexico, where the atomic bomb was developed as part of the Manhattan Project under her father's supervision. Oppenheimer was Kitty's 4th husband, but it was her second marriage to a young communist that caused issues with her relationship to their family. Her noted ties to the Communist Party, as well as Robert's own, caused problems for her children throughout their lives. As of 2023, Peter lives a secluded life in rural New Mexico. Meanwhile, his sister, Tony, sadly died young by suicide in 1977 at the age of 33. Despite the tragedies surrounding the family, Charles Oppenheimer and Dorothy Vanderford, Peter's son and daughter, opened up in a 2015 interview with the Atomic Heritage Foundation about their father's childhood.
He doesn't agree with his perception that there was some terrible family. We have an extremely close family, and that was passed down from my dad.
Though loving by most accounts, some suggest that J. Robert Oppenheimer, who died in 1967 from throat cancer, never fully connected with either one of his children, and that lack of communication deeply affected his son. The same could be said for both Tony and Peter's troubled relationship with their mother, Kitty, who lived with alcohol use issues and died in 1972 from a pulmonary embolism. Kitty felt Peter's pregnancy early on in her relationship with Oppenheimer strained their marriage, and as a result, she was reportedly tough on Peter, who took after his father. According to 109 East Palace, Robert Oppenheimer and the secret city of Los Alamos, a friend of Kitty's mentioned she married Oppenheimer the old-fashioned way. She got pregnant, and Oppenheimer was just innocent enough to go for it. Peter was born so soon after his parents married that his father reportedly nicknamed him Pronto. Unlike his father, Peter never excelled in academia, both at private and public school. Later in life, Peter reportedly worked as a carpenter, and he has 3 children of his own. Today, Peter lives at the Perro Caliente Ranch in New Mexico his father purchased when he was a boy. In his 2015 interview with the AHF, Peter's son Charles said when his father was a teenager, he told his own dad, "I'm going to take care of it." Unlike her brother, Robert Oppenheimer's daughter, Tony, was by all accounts a good student. In 1966, she graduated with a BA from Oberlin College. Born at Los Alamos, Tony had polio while young and struggled to cope with her mother Kitty's worsening alcoholism, as well as her father's aloof personality. In her childhood, Tony and Kitty Oppenheimer were always at each other's throat, according to a friend of the family. Through her polio treatment, Tony was introduced to St. John, a remote spot in the U.S. Virgin Islands where she enjoyed life in isolation. Unfortunately, Tony's professional aspirations were stymied by her family's alleged communist sympathies, even costing her a job as a translator for the United Nations. On top of her professional issues, Tony was greatly affected by her father's death. At the end of her life, Tony returned to St. John, where she spread her mother's ashes, near where her father's remains are also spread. Tony died by suicide in St. John's shortly after her 33rd birthday and the dissolution of her second marriage. She died in the home her father built on the island. If you or someone you know is struggling or in crisis, help is available. Call or text 988 or chat 988lifeline.org.
Everybody's heard of Abe Lincoln, but what do you really know about his kids? From tadpoles to typhoid, here's the story of the Lincoln family. Among the many tragedies of Abraham Lincoln's life was the fact that only one of his children lived to adulthood, his oldest son, Robert Todd Lincoln. Born in Springfield, Illinois in 1843, Robert did not have a happy life. He claimed that his earliest memory was that of his father waving goodbye as he left on business, and the two always had a distant relationship. Robert resented Lincoln's devotion to his political career, and he especially resented the attention that came from being the son of a public man. Yet he was reportedly not above trading on his famous surname while studying at Harvard. During the Civil War, Robert tried to enlist in the Union Army, to his mother's horror. It's believed that Mary Lincoln pressed her husband to secure Robert a position on General Ulysses S. Grant's staff, keeping him away from combat. He returned to Washington, D.C. at the war's end and was at his father's bedside after his assassination. It was the first of 3 presidential assassinations Robert would be associated with. He later witnessed the shooting of James Garfield and was outside the building where William McKinley was shot and killed. Though estranged from his father for much of his life, Robert wept over Lincoln's dying body and later followed him into politics. He was Secretary of War to James Garfield and Minister to Britain for Benjamin Harrison, though he grumbled at times that he was only appointed to such roles for his name. He died in 1926 at the age of 82. The Lincoln's second-born son, Edward Baker, is an enigmatic figure in American history. Born in 1846, his childhood exploits became fodder for his parents' letters. For example, Abraham Lincoln wrote about Eddie's attempts to talk in April 1848. A month later, Mary Todd Lincoln wrote to her husband that Eddie became so attached to a kitten his older brother had found that he screamed at his step-grandmother when she tried to throw it out. Sadly, Eddie wouldn't live to reach his 4th birthday. He became seriously ill at the end of 1849, likely of tuberculosis. Eddie died on February 1, 1850, to his parents' great grief. He was initially buried in a cemetery near the family home, but his remains were later interred with those of his father and brother in a family tomb. Surprisingly enough, William Wallace Lincoln's namesake wasn't the famous Wallace of Scottish history.
They may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom!
Instead, Willie was named for Mary Todd's brother-in-law. He was born in 1850 in Springfield and took after his father in temperament and personality. Abraham Lincoln reportedly recognized the similarity, too. With the expansion of American railways, he was able to travel home more frequently and take a larger role in Willie's upbringing than he had in Robert's, and the two quickly grew close. While the other Lincoln boys could sometimes provoke ire outside the family, Willie seems to have been a well-loved child. He was studious, religious, well-mannered, and kind. He was also much more comfortable with his father's duties and fame than Robert had been. Willie, the pride and joy of the Lincolns, became a source of great personal grief for them in the Civil War. He died in February 1862 after a short bout of typhoid fever. After Willie's death, Abe Lincoln said, "He was too good for this earth. I know that he is much better off in heaven, but then we loved him so. It is hard to have him die." Thomas Tad Lincoln, the youngest of the brothers, was arguably Abraham Lincoln's favorite child. He was certainly indulged at every opportunity. Born in Springfield in 1853, Thomas was named for Lincoln's father and nicknamed Tad by the future president for his squirmy nature as a baby, wiggly as a tadpole, as Lincoln put it. Tad was rambunctious and mischievous as a child, and while he could be affectionate with his family, his pranks and outbursts made him difficult for tutors, secretaries, and the White House staff. It's been speculated that Lincoln was so lax in disciplining Tad because his youngest son had a speech impediment. He also came down with typhoid fever at the same time Willie did, and some believe the loss of the older boy, as well as Tad's lucky recovery, might have made Lincoln even more indulgent of his youngest child's behavior. Tad was the only of Lincoln's children besides Robert to outlive their father. He was actually seeing Aladdin and the Magic Lamp in another theater when Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's. After his father's death, Tad reportedly faced his prospective future with maturity, though he still struggled to read and write. After several years of traveling Europe with his mother, he became ill on his return to the United States in 1871 and died, most likely due to tuberculosis. He was 18 years old. With Abraham Lincoln's long absences from the home during his congressional years, Mary Todd Lincoln was their children's primary caregiver, and she was even more indulgent a parent than Lincoln. True to her general disposition, she would sometimes lose her temper with her children, but she forgave easily, and even her harshest critics considered her an attentive and loving mother. But Mary Todd's relationship with her sons became complicated as the family suffered tragedy after tragedy. Willie's death left her in such a despondent state that Lincoln feared that she might need to be hospitalized in an asylum. She and Tad grew exceptionally close after Lincoln's assassination, but Mary fretted over his learning difficulties. When they went abroad, Tad became more of a protector and caregiver to his mother. In letters back home, Mary would say that he reminded her of his father. Her most difficult relationship was with Robert, with whom she grew estranged after Lincoln's assassination. Mary's increasingly erratic behavior after the loss of 3 sons and her husband worried Robert, and he had his mother committed to an Illinois asylum in 1875. This action was taken on the advice of Mary's doctors, but she resented Robert nonetheless. She later used the press and the law to confirm her sanity and win her freedom. She and Robert kept a frosty relationship until her death in 1882.
Did all of Judy Garland's kids become performers like her? And did they struggle with the dark side of fame like their mom did? Keep watching to learn about the lives of the children of one of Hollywood's brightest stars. Judy Garland was one of the most famous stars of Hollywood's golden age. The talented singer and actress was an acclaimed and beloved performer at the height of her career, and is probably best known for starring in the classic film The Wizard of Oz. Unfortunately, underneath that glitz and glam was a troubled woman with serious substance abuse issues. Despite her personal struggles and her death at the age of 47, Garland had a successful career and a growing family. Garland's 5 marriages resulted in the births of 3 children: Liza Minnelli, Lorna Luft, and Joey Luft. So what happened to Garland's kids, especially after her untimely death? Liza Minnelli is Garland's eldest child. Her father was film and stage director Vincent Minnelli, Judy's second husband. Liza followed in her mother's footsteps and is an award-winning singer, actress, and dancer. She has performed on the big screen, Broadway, and television, and has had a successful music career. In the midst of that professional achievement, however, she has also reportedly battled with substance abuse and has been married 4 times so far. As of 2022, Minnelli is still working, and according to MSN, is contributing to an album with Michael Feinstein. She made a surprise appearance at the 2022 Oscars alongside pop sensation Lady Gaga. Regarding her relationship with her mother, she told Closer Weekly that she prefers to hold on to the positive memories.
Was she a good mother?
The best.
Really? Because we always
She did not leave her kids for a second.
In 1952, Garland gave birth to the first of her 2 children with her third husband, Sid Luft, daughter Lorna Luft. Though Lorna refers to her childhood as idyllic, by the time she reached the age of 12, she became aware of her mother's struggles and had to process Garland's divorce from her father. Following her mother's death in 1969, Lorna also chose to pursue a singing and acting career, going on to star in films including Grease 2 and My Giant. She met and married rocker Jake Hooker in 1977 and had 2 children before divorcing. Luft is now remarried and has 4 grandchildren. According to Today, her newest grandchild was born in March of 2022. Luft has suffered a few medical setbacks over the last decade. She was diagnosed with breast cancer and had surgeries for it in 2012 and 2015. She was then diagnosed with a brain tumor in 2018. She has had that tumor successfully removed as well, according to Refinery 29. She wrote a book about her family in 1998 titled Me and My Shadows, a family memoir. She published another book in 2019, A Star is Born, Judy Garland and the Film That Got Away. Despite her own battle with cocaine during the 70s and 80s, she is now drug-free.
It is a family disease, and it is a disease.
Garland's only son and youngest child, Joey Luft, was born in 1955. Unlike his sisters, Luft decided to remain mostly out of the spotlight for the majority of his life. This doesn't mean he wasn't into show business. He just preferred to remain behind the camera, according to the Los Angeles Times. In 2014, Luft created a Judy Garland concert with Joey Luft, a theater show featuring colorized clips from the Judy Garland Show, with Luft and a family friend talking about the late star. As of 2022, Luft has also collaborated with producer, actress, and singer Angela Ingersoll, who earned an Emmy nomination for her portrayal of Garland in Get Happy. Angela Ingersoll sings Judy Garland. According to Broadway World, her performances have earned her the title of heiress apparent to the Garland legacy. Like his sister Liza, Joey would prefer to avoid talking about the bad things when it comes to his mom. Following Garland's death, he had come to terms with her drug addiction, though he was only a teenager when she passed. Though it was a challenge to wrap his mind around, he believed that through his mom and her issues, she was still a great person. He describes her as a caring person with a great sense of humor. Joey still works on films and documentaries, many of which honor his mom. If you or anyone you know is struggling with addiction issues, help is available. Visit the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration website or contact SAMHSA's National Helpline at 1-800-662-HELP 4357.
Prince Leopold probably would have survived the accident that killed him, if not for the rare genetic disorder that he inherited from his mother. While the first child of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert was only a girl, the daughter they nicknamed Vicky was still destined for great things from a young age. Born in 1840, the marriage of Vicky in 1858 was orchestrated so she would join another major power, Prussia, and influence policy there. While she had little choice in her marriage partner, fortunately she and Crown Prince Frederick fell madly in love and went on to have 8 children. The country's victory in the Franco-Prussian War saw the creation of the country of Germany, with the Prussian royal family in charge, and Frederick became heir to the new empire. Frederick and Vicky planned to rule as co-regents and steer Germany into a more liberal direction. But in one of history's great what-ifs, Frederick only reigned for 99 days before dying of throat cancer. Their son Wilhelm became the new Kaiser, with the widowed Vicky choosing to wear black for the rest of her life like her mother, Queen Victoria. And like her mother, Vicky also died in 1901. Her death at the age of 60 meant she didn't have to watch as her son, who undid all his parents' liberal policies, waged war against England during World War I. While Queen Victoria was a woman, she wanted a son to inherit her throne, so everyone was thrilled when her second child was a boy. Born in 1841, Prince Albert Edward, known as Bertie, was heir to the throne from day one. However, Victoria found endless faults with her heir, and she even managed to blame him irrationally for Prince Albert's death in 1861. What was true was that Bertie grew up wild. It was hoped that marriage would calm him down, but despite his marriage to the stunning Princess Alexandra of Denmark and the 5 children they had together, he kept up his playboy ways. He was not faithful to Alexandra, having continual affairs with aristocratic women in their circle of friends, including the mother of Winston Churchill. One part of the problem was that Bertie was constantly bored. Queen Victoria, instead of training him for the role he would one day have as king, instead actively avoided giving him anything official to do, so Bertie filled his days with things he found entertaining. Fashion and parties to shooting and women.
Prince Edward was a pleasure seeker. His social life, it was sort of an endless round of house parties, shooting parties, race parties.
He finally became king in 1901, taking the regnal name Edward VII. As monarch, he traveled extensively in Europe and tried to keep peace on the continent, including with his despised nephew, Kaiser Wilhelm II. After having waited so long to become king, he reigned for only 9 years. He died in 1910, aged 68. Princess Alice was born in 1843. She married the future Grand Duke Louis IV of Hesse in 1862, but as her father Prince Albert had died 7 months before the wedding, it was a subdued affair. Sadly, her luck never got better. When the Austro-Prussian War began, Hesse sided with Austria, meaning Alice and her sister Vicky were technically enemies. Alice's marriage also deteriorated over time, as shown by the pained letters she wrote to him. For example, one said in part, "I've tried again and again to talk to you about more serious things when I felt the need to do so, but we never meet each other. I feel true companionship is an impossibility for us because our thoughts will never meet."
Alice had a very strong, feisty sense of self.
Alice and Louis had 7 children, some of whom died tragically. One son was a hemophiliac who died in 1873 at the age of 2 after falling out of a window. 5 years later, a diphtheria epidemic struck the family, claiming the life of 4-year-old Marie. While comforting her remaining children, Alice was infected herself and died at the age of 35, exactly 17 years to the day after her father. It wasn't the family's last tragedy, though. Alice's daughter Alexandra married into the Russian royal family and became Tsarina, and in 1918, she was murdered along with her husband and all their children during the Russian Revolution. Born in 1844, Prince Alfred knew he wanted to go into the Royal Navy when he was just a child. He shipped out at 14, and the next 3 decades of his life were devoted to the Navy in one way or another. Incredibly well-traveled, he visited many of the colonies of the British Empire. However, it could have turned out differently. When the King of Greece was deposed in 1862, a vote in that country picked the 18-year-old Alfred to be their new ruler, but for various political and personal reasons, that didn't end up happening. This didn't mean Alfred was stuck with his eventual English title Duke of Edinburgh forever, though. Since his older brother was going to be a bit busy with the job of being king once her mother died, Alfred inherited the title of Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha from their uncle Ernest in 1893. He was also made the Royal Navy's Admiral of the Fleet that same year. Like his mother, who survived 8 assassination attempts during her reign, someone also once tried to kill Alfred while he was in Australia. He wrote a letter after the event, promising he didn't take it personally. The cowardly act of one individual has not in any degree shaken my confidence in the loyalty of the people of this colony. The prince married Grand Duchess Maria Alexandrovna of Russia in 1874, and the couple had 5 children, although they weren't actually very happy together. Alfred died 6 months before his mother on July 30th, 1900, age 55. Of all Queen Victoria's children, Princess Helena, who was born in 1846, was perhaps the most active in the kind of charity work expected of the royal family today. She assisted with the founding of the British Red Cross, and she was especially passionate about advancing the career of nurses in the country, holding the position of president for both the Workhouse Infirmary Nursing Association and the Royal British Nurses Association. Outside of the healthcare field, she helped get the School of Art Needlework, now the Royal School of Needlework, off the ground with fundraising and by becoming its first president. The reason Helena was able to do so much work in her home country was that, unlike some of her siblings, she never left. While she married a foreigner, Prince Christian of Schleswig-Holstein, he was effectively broke, so he agreed to stay with her in Britain where she could be close to her mother. While they had a decade-and-a-half age gap, the marriage was a very happy one, and the couple had 5 children together, although, tragically, one died at only 8 days old, and Helena's 6th and final pregnancy ended in a stillbirth. Their eldest child, a son, died of disease while fighting in the Boer War in 1900. During the 1890s, Helena became addicted to opium, which was legal at the time. After being cut off by her doctor, she overcame her dependency, although it was a difficult process. She ultimately died on June 9, 1923, age 77. Born in 1848, Princess Louise was one of those people who was genuinely ahead of their time. A skilled artist, she was especially adept at sculpting, and today her works are part of the collections of the National Gallery of Canada, the Royal Academy of Arts, and Britain's National Portrait Gallery, among others. She mixed with artists from very different backgrounds than she had. She even openly supported women's suffrage, but she had a difficult youth.
And she was constantly expected to be in full-time mourning for her father. She wasn't expected to enjoy anything.
Knowing she had to get married, and without any especially good options, Louise took the then unheard-of decision to marry one of her mother's subjects, rather than a member of the royal family, the Scottish Marquess of Lorne, later Duke of Argyll. Unfortunately, the marriage had significant ups and downs. The couple, who did not have any children, separated and reunited several times. When her husband was appointed Governor General of Canada, she moved with him to North America, but returned to England alone after being injured in a serious sleigh accident. The two ultimately reconciled in 1911, just 3 years before his death. Louise lived alone for the next quarter of a century before she passed away on December 3, 1939, aged 91, wearing her wedding veil. Born in 1850, Prince Arthur was named after the illustrious Duke of Wellington, who had won the Battle of Waterloo against Napoleon before Queen Victoria was even born. It's perhaps no surprise that with that connection to British military greatness, Arthur ended up in the army himself. He enrolled in a military academy at 16, and after graduating 2 years later, he would spend the next 4 decades in postings around the world, everywhere from Ireland to Canada to Gibraltar to Egypt and even India. He saw action in several battles and met President Ulysses S. Grant in Washington, D.C. in 1870. Arthur married Princess Louise Margaret of Prussia in 1879, and they had 3 children, including their eldest daughter Margaret, who would go on to marry the heir to the Swedish throne. In 1911, like his brother-in-law, the Marquess of Lorne before him, Arthur was appointed Governor General of Canada, a post he would hold for 5 years. The prince loved the country deeply, both the eastern cities and the wild western part of the country. According to Mohawk tribe member Pauline Johnson, her father had made Arthur a chief of the Iroquois nation in a ceremony back in 1869, and he passionately defended Arthur as a friend of the First Nations people. Arthur died on January 16, 1942, aged 91. Born in 1853, Prince Leopold's life was hampered by the fact that he was born with hemophilia. While history would prove some of Queen Victoria's daughters also carried the recessive gene and passed it on to their children, Leopold was the only son who inherited the condition. Despite the very real danger that any injury could kill him, as well as suffering from epilepsy, the prince still managed to have a pretty full life. Unlike most of his siblings, Leopold attended college at the University of Oxford. There, he became friends with both Alice Little and the man who was inspired to write Alice in Wonderland for her, Charles Dodgson, aka Lewis Carroll. Leopold and Little remained friends for the rest of his life. Despite carrying a deadly condition that could be passed on to his children or grandchildren, Leopold was still expected to marry. In 1882, he wed Princess Helen of Waldeck and Pyrmont, and they had 2 children, one of which was born after Leopold's premature death. In 1884, Leopold was in France when he fell on some stairs. The injuries that resulted were too severe for a hemophiliac to recover from, and he died aged 30. Princess Beatrice was the last of Queen Victoria's children, born in 1857, and the monarch planned for her youngest child to stay beside her forever, unmarried and performing as essentially a personal servant. This meant Beatrice held an important position at court and was even allowed access to government papers that Victoria refused to let her heir Bertie see. For many years, Beatrice was okay with this plan, having declared as a child, "I shall never be married, I shall stay with my mother." There were some men whose names came up as possible husbands, most notably Grand Duke Louis IV of Hesse, the widower of Beatrice's sister Alice. But Queen Victoria wanted her daughter home with her, and Beatrice seemed to want this too. until 1884 when she attended a wedding and met Prince Henry of Battenberg. Beatrice wanted to marry him, but Queen Victoria, the most powerful woman in the world, wouldn't allow it.
Somebody said the Queen is absolutely insane when it comes to asserting her own maternal authority.
The women were at an impasse for months, refusing to speak to each other while still living together. At dinner, they would pass notes when necessary. Finally, Victoria gave in on the condition the couple move in with her so she still had Beatrice around at all times. The couple had 4 children and were very happy. Beatrice was the last of Queen Victoria's children to die, aged 87 in 1944.
How did the child of Hollywood legend Clark Gable end up sleeping in a drawer? And whatever happened to her? One of the more memorable among Hollywood's leading men, Clark Gable was once described by Life magazine, all man and then some. Born William Clark Gable on February 1, 1901 in Ohio, he started acting in his early 20s after actor Josephine Dillon took an interest in him. Dillon began coaching the young Gable and even paid for his dental work. Dillon, 17 years Gable's senior, became his first wife in 1924, just as he began appearing in silent films. He broke through in 1931 after appearing in 13 movies that year and impressing both film executives and moviegoers with his strength and style. Gable would go on to appear in countless films, winning the Academy Award for Best Actor in 1935 for his role in It Happened One Night, and forever entering the pop culture pantheon with his performance as Rhett Butler in the 1939 epic Gone with the Wind.
Where shall I go? What shall I do?
Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn.
Eventually known as the King of Hollywood, Gable was also known for his many marriages. In addition to Dillon, Gable married 4 more women. First was socialite Maria Rhea Langham, and then actor Carole Lombard, who was killed in a plane crash in 1942 and thought to be the love of Gable's life. After that, Gable married Lady Sylvia Ashley, and finally actor Kay Williams. Gable and Williams married in 1955. 5 years later, Williams was pregnant when Gable died of a heart attack. Clark Gable's son with Kay Williams Gable was, as far as the public knew, Clark's first and only child. Clark was quoted as having told a reporter regarding his impending fatherhood, "This is a dividend that has come too late in life. When I wind up this picture, I'm taken off until after the baby is born. I want to be there, and I want to be there a good many months afterward." John Clark Gable was born 4 months after his father's death. In 2000, the Los Angeles Times published a feature on the younger Gable, who was preparing to race in the Baja 500 off-road race. John, then 39, noted that his father was also interested in road racing, even starring as a race car driver in the 1950 film To Please a Lady. He said, "I think my father's love of auto racing, which I learned about from my mother, has been a special bond with his memory. My mom tried to discourage me from racing, but I just knew it was in my blood." The younger Gable has also acted in a handful of films, including an appearance in A Burning Passion, The Margaret Mitchell Story, a biopic of the author of Gone with the Wind. Despite the fact that it wasn't acknowledged during his lifetime, Clark Gable did have another child, Judy Lewis, his secret daughter with actor Loretta Young. According to Lewis's 2011 obituary in the Washington Post, she was conceived during production of the 1935 movie The Call of the Wild, in which Gable and Young had starred. Young was 22 and unmarried at the time, while Gable was 34 and married. To protect their careers, Young went into hiding and secretly gave birth to Judy in Los Angeles before sending her to an orphanage when she was just a few months old. Young later returned to the orphanage and adopted her own biological daughter, presenting the child to the public as her adopted daughter. In her 1994 memoir, Uncommon Knowledge, Lewis revealed that Gable visited her mother once when Lewis was a baby, giving Young $400 and telling her to, quote, buy her a decent bed, after finding their daughter sleeping in a drawer. Gable then visited her when she was 15. Lewis wrote that they chatted about her life for an hour before he thanked her, cupped her face in his hands, and kissed her on the forehead. They never saw each other again. Lewis also did some acting work before working as a psychotherapist. She died in Pennsylvania in 2011 at the age of 76.